Alright, so let's talk about this, because 2 days ago something happened that genuinely shocked a lot of people who follow this stuff, and for the millions who don't, it needs to be talked about because it affects more than just Mexico. The Mexican army killed El Mencho, the most wanted drug trafficker in the Western Hemisphere, the man the FBI, the DEA, and the State Department had been hunting for years. Gone. And the country he ran his empire from is partially on fire right now because of it. So, today, I want to take you through the whole story, not just the headline, where this man came from, what kind of childhood produces someone like this, how he went from picking avocados in a village nobody's heard of to running the most powerful drug cartel in the world, what made the CJNG different from every cartel that came before it, how the operation to kill him actually went down, what's happening in Mexico right now as we speak, and what comes next. Because, honestly, what comes next might be the most important part of this whole story. Let's start at the very beginning. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in a tiny community called Culotitlan, in the municipality of Aguililla, Michoacán. And if Aguililla sounds familiar, it's because that region has been ground zero for some of the most brutal cartel violence in Mexico over the last decade. But in 1966, it was just a poor, rural agricultural town. Dirt roads, no real economy, families doing what they could to survive. Nemesio grew up picking avocados. That was life. He dropped out of school before finishing primary education, which wasn't unusual for kids in that area at that time. The opportunities simply weren't there, and at some point, like so many young men from that region, he made the decision to head north. He crossed into the United States illegally and ended up in California. In California, he worked for a while but got pulled into drug trafficking. He was arrested on heroin charges and eventually deported back to Mexico. And that deportation, that moment, turned out to be one of the most consequential events in the history of Mexican organized crime. Because Nemesio didn't come back broken. He came back with experience, with contacts, and with an ambition that a small town in Michoacán couldn't contain. Now, here's the part that always catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time. After his deportation, he became a police officer, a legitimate badge-carrying law enforcement officer in the state of Jalisco. Whether he genuinely tried to go straight and got corrupted by the system, or whether he saw the police as a strategic move, a way to learn how investigations worked, how law enforcement communicated, what their weaknesses were, we don't know for certain, probably some combination of both. But it didn't last long, and when he left law enforcement, he was fully committed to the criminal world with no intention of looking back. And then came the marriage that changed everything. He married Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, and that name is crucial. The Gonzalez Valencia family, known in criminal circles as Los Quines, were one of the most powerful and financially sophisticated criminal networks in Mexico. These weren't street-level drug dealers, these were money people. They moved and laundered enormous amounts of cash. They had deep connections across Mexico and internationally. By marrying into that family, Nemesio didn't just get a wife, he got infrastructure. He got financial backing. He got a network of relationships that most criminals spend their entire careers trying to build. He essentially married into the underworld's version of old money, and he was smart enough to know exactly what he had. Around 2007 to 2009, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, starts taking shape. And I want you to understand the context because it explains a lot about how they rose so fast. This was the height of Felipe Calderon's war on drugs in Mexico. The government was going hard after the established cartels, Sinaloa, the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization. There was enormous chaos. Old power structures were cracking, and in that chaos, there was an opening for someone willing to be more aggressive, more militarized, and more ruthless than anyone else on the board. El Mencho and the CJNG stepped into that opening. But here's what made them genuinely different. Old-school Mexican cartels, and the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo is the clearest example, operated on a philosophy of avoiding direct confrontation. You bribe people. You corrupt institutions. You try to stay invisible to the general public. You run your business quietly, and you don't poke the government unless you have to. The CJNG threw that entire playbook out the window. From very early on, they were building what was essentially a private army. Armored fighting vehicles, not just bulletproofed SUVs but purpose-built armored trucks, rocket launchers, Drones modified to carry and drop explosives. They put out propaganda videos showing hundreds of gunmen in full tactical gear lined up like soldiers. They wanted rivals, government, and the public to see exactly what they were. In 2015, they pulled off something that still gets discussed in security and intelligence circles. They ambushed a federal police convoy in Jalisco and killed 15 officers. When the government sent a military helicopter to respond, and remember this is the Mexican military, not local police, they shot it down with a rocket launcher. They shot down a military helicopter. That was a message delivered with total clarity. We are not afraid of you. We are the power in this territory. And rivals heard that message. Corrupt officials heard it, and the cartel expanded with a speed that was almost unprecedented in Mexican criminal history. Within a decade, the CJNG had a presence in every single state in Mexico, every one. And internationally, they expanded to a degree that rivaled the biggest criminal organizations anywhere in the world. Europe, Asia, working with groups across South America. The DEA assessed them as equal in power to the Sinaloa cartel in terms of global reach. The FBI named El Mencho their top target, not just in Mexico or Latin America, but globally. The State Department put a $15 million bounty on his head. And the reason the Americans wanted him so badly beyond the cocaine and the heroin was fentanyl. The CJNG became one of the primary manufacturers and distributors of fentanyl entering the United States, the synthetic opioid crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. In small towns, in big cities, across every demographic, the CJNG has documented responsibility for a massive portion of that. That's not rhetoric or exaggeration, that's what the DEA has put in front of Congress. When politicians talk about the fentanyl crisis, this is one of the organizations they're talking about, and through all of this, El Mencho himself remained essentially invisible. There were no recent photographs of him. He gave no interviews. He moved constantly. He communicated through channels that were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. For years there were genuine debates among analysts about whether he was still personally running things, or whether the cartel had simply outgrown any single person's direct control. He was running things, right up until 2 days ago. Now let's talk about the years leading up to his death, because this operation didn't happen in isolation. The pressure on El Mencho had been building systematically for a long time, and his inner circle was being dismantled piece by piece for years before the end. His brother was arrested. His son, known as El Menchito, was extradited to the United States and is currently in federal custody facing serious trafficking charges. His brother-in-law, one of the key financial figures in Los Quinas who gave the organization so much of its money management capability, was taken down. His wife Rosa Linda was arrested in Mexico. The family structure that gave the CJNG its cohesion at the top was being systematically removed, and yet El Mencho himself remained free, remained operational. The organization kept running, which tells you something about how well he had built it and how effectively he had insulated himself. There were reports for several years that his health was deteriorating, serious kidney problems, dialysis. There was speculation in intelligence circles that this was actually making him easier to track, that the need for regular medical treatment was creating patterns, creating vulnerabilities that didn't exist when he was fully mobile and unpredictable. In February 2025, the Trump administration designated the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization, same legal category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That designation brought new legal tools, expanded prosecution powers in U.S. federal courts, more aggressive financial sanctions, new authorities to go after anyone providing material support to the cartel. And it signaled a level of commitment from Washington to taking down the CJNG that went beyond anything previous administrations had done publicly. The intelligence cooperation between the U.S. and Mexican governments intensified. And then on Sunday, February 22, 2026, it all came together in a small town in the Jalisco highlands, Tapalpa. If you don't know it, it's a small colonial town, about 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara. Cool climate, cobblestone streets, known as a weekend getaway spot for people from the city. Not an obvious hideout for the world's most wanted man, but that's probably exactly why he was there. Small, quiet, not a place where heavy surveillance operations would stand out. Residents in the area had noticed something in the days before. Military helicopters overhead, convoys moving through. The kind of unusual activity that people in rural Mexico in 2026 have learned to pay attention to and be nervous about. Then on Sunday it happened quickly. Mexican army forces moved in on his location. There was a confrontation. A firefight. El Mencho was wounded. He was put on a helicopter to be airlifted to Mexico City. He died in transit before he ever arrived. 4 of his men were killed at the scene. 2 more died during transfer. 2 were taken alive. When they secured the location, they found armored vehicles, rocket launchers, weapon stockpiles, the full CJNG arsenal, even in what was supposed to be a safe house. 3 soldiers were wounded. Given what the CJNG was known to be capable of, given that these were the people who shot down a military helicopter a decade ago, the fact that the army completed this operation with 3 wounded and no deaths on their side is remarkable. Either El Mencho's security apparatus had been compromised in ways we don't fully understand yet, or the element of surprise was so complete that there was simply no time to mount a real defense. The White House confirmed U.S. intelligence support for the operation within hours, very quickly and very publicly. The Trump administration was eager to be associated with this outcome, and that tells you how significant American involvement behind the scenes actually was. Years of surveillance, signals intelligence, cooperation with Mexican military and intelligence services, all of it came together in that moment in Tapalpa. The $15 million bounty on his head will never be collected. El Mencho is dead. And then came the response. Because taking out the boss of an organization this size doesn't end the violence, sometimes it releases it. Within hours of the news breaking, the CJNG activated what clearly looked like a coordinated nationwide operation. Gunmen across the country began blocking highways simultaneously, not in one area, across 20 Mexican states at the same time, over 250 separate blockades. Vehicles set on fire and pushed across major roads. Highways connecting major cities simply shut down. This was not spontaneous grief or disorganized panic. This was coordinated. This was the cartel demonstrating that even with their leader gone, they retained the organizational capacity to bring the country to a standstill. That message was directed at the Mexican government, at rivals, and at the world. Jalisco was the epicenter. Guadalajara, Mexico's second largest metropolitan area, millions of people, a major economic and cultural center, went into a kind of paralysis that the city hasn't seen in years. Businesses closed, streets emptied. Videos circulating on social media showed smoke rising over the skyline, people abandoning their cars on highways and running on foot, passengers sprinting through the international airport in panic. Puerto Vallarta, one of Mexico's most visited tourist destinations, a place where hundreds of thousands of international visitors go every year, saw violence spill into its streets. A prison guard was killed during a riot inside the local jail, apparently coordinated with the chaos happening outside the walls at the same time. Airlines started making real-time security decisions. Southwest canceled flights. Alaska Airlines followed. Delta pulled out of routes to Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. When major U.S. carriers are canceling flights somewhere in real time, that's not a minor thing. That's a visible, internationally significant signal about the security situation on the ground. At least 14 people were killed in the unrest that followed the news. 7 of them were National Guard troops, Mexican security forces killed by cartel gunmen in retaliation within 24 hours of El Mencho's death. Think about what that means. The government eliminates the cartel boss, and within 1 day, 7 soldiers are dead in response. That is a demonstration of organizational power that is hard to overstate. President Claudia Sheinbaum came out publicly by Monday and said the situation was under control, that blockades had been cleared, that the government had responded effectively, and largely the roads did reopen. The immediate crisis de-escalated, but the underlying tension didn't go anywhere. It's sitting there right now like the air before a storm. So what actually comes next? That's where everyone's attention is focused, and honestly, that's the most important question coming out of all of this. The honest answer is nobody knows for certain, and that uncertainty is itself part of what makes this moment so potentially dangerous. El Mencho built the CJNG around his own authority and his own personal relationships. He was the center of gravity for an organization that the DEA describes as more of a franchise system than a traditional hierarchy. About 90 affiliated organizations across Mexico, all operating under the CJNG brand, paying tribute up the chain, receiving protection and resources in return. Holding something that decentralized together requires a figure with enormous personal authority and the credibility to enforce discipline. El Mencho had that. The question is, who has it now? His stepson, who goes by various aliases and who oversees the cartel's paramilitary wing, is seen by most analysts as the most likely candidate to try to step into the leadership role. He has operational experience, he has relationships with the armed factions, he understands the military side of the organization. But running the paramilitary arm of a cartel and running the entire cartel are completely different things. The financial networks, the international supply chains for fentanyl precursors coming out of China, the cocaine pipelines coming up through Central America, the corruption relationships with politicians and law enforcement across multiple states, that's an enormously complex operation. The people managing different pieces of that may not automatically fall in line behind whoever tries to claim the top position, and history in Mexico gives us reason to be very cautious about what follows a major leadership takedown. When El Chapo went to prison, and then when El Mayo Zambada was removed last year, the Sinaloa cartel didn't peacefully reorganize. It fractured. Commanders who had been cooperating under the Sinaloa umbrella turned on each other. Factions formed. Violence in Sinaloa reached levels that even by Mexican standards were shocking and sustained. Hundreds of people dead in cartel-on-cartel fighting over months, regular civilians caught in the middle, communities destroyed. That is what analysts are watching for now with the CJNG, not whether the organization survives. Organizations this large and this wealthy tend to survive the loss of leaders. The question is whether it stays unified, or whether it breaks apart into competing factions. And if it breaks apart, the resulting violence, as those factions fight over territory and resources, could be worse than anything El Mencho presided over. Rivals are watching too. The remaining Sinaloa factions. Regional groups that have been held at bay by CJNG power for years. Any sign of real weakness or fracture in the CJNG is an invitation for those groups to move into territories they couldn't touch before. And that kind of territorial competition in Mexico has historically produced some of the worst civilian casualties the country has experienced. There's one more dimension to this that I want to make sure we talk about because it's getting lost in the immediate news coverage. Mexico is co-hosting the 2026 FIFA World Cup, along with the United States and Canada. And Guadalajara is one of the designated host cities. The Estadio Akron there is scheduled to host multiple group stage matches. There is a World Cup playoff tournament set for late March in Guadalajara, which is literally weeks away from right now. 2 days ago, Guadalajara had smoke rising over its skyline, major airlines canceling flights, and people running through its international airport in panic. That is the city that is supposed to welcome tens of thousands of international visitors in a matter of weeks, and hundreds of thousands more over the summer. FIFA and the co-host nations are watching this very carefully. The Mexican government has an enormous political incentive beyond the security of its own citizens to stabilize the situation before the world shows up. That kind of external pressure can actually be useful. It focuses resources, it creates accountability. President Sheinbaum knows that how Mexico looks to the world over the next few months matters enormously, but it also creates a potential flashpoint. If the new CJNG leadership or a rival organization wants to demonstrate power, wants to send a message to the Mexican government that things are not under control, having a massive international event in your backyard is a tempting opportunity. I'm not predicting an attack or a specific incident. I'm saying that smart security analysts are thinking about exactly this scenario, and the Mexican government is going to have to put significant resources into making sure that World Cup venues and visitor areas are genuinely secure. Let me bring this all together because I think it's important to be honest about what this moment actually means and what it doesn't mean. El Mencho's death is genuinely significant, not just symbolically. Taking out the leader of the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere required years of intelligence work, sustained cooperation between two governments that don't always cooperate easily, and soldiers and operators who put themselves at real risk. That matters, and it deserves to be acknowledged clearly. And for the Americans who are watching this is directly connected to the fentanyl crisis that has devastated communities across the United States. El Mencho's organization was one of the primary engines of that crisis. His death disrupts that engine, at least temporarily. That has real consequences for real families. But here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't end the fentanyl crisis. The demand that drives that crisis is still there. The precursor chemicals still exist. The manufacturing knowledge and the distribution networks don't disappear because the boss died. Someone will try to keep those pipelines running. It doesn't uncorrupt the Mexican institutions that the CJNG has spent 15 years systematically corrupting with enormous amounts of money. It doesn't change the poverty and lack of opportunity in places like Aguililla, Michoacán, that produce young men who look at the cartel and see the only real path forward available to them. What it does is create a moment, a disruption in a system that had become very efficient and very stable under El Mencho's leadership. Whether that disruption leads to something better, a genuine weakening of the CJNG, a reduction in violence over time, a breakthrough in the fentanyl fight, or whether it leads to something worse in the short term as factions fight over the wreckage, is genuinely unknown right now. History gives us reasons to be humble about declaring victory after moments like this. Pablo Escobar died in 1993, and the Colombian cocaine trade reorganized and in many ways became more efficient without him. El Chapo went to prison and the Sinaloa cartel adapted and kept running. These organizations are resilient in ways that are genuinely frustrating. But history also tells us these moments can shift trajectories in ways that aren't immediately obvious. That they open doors that were previously closed, that they create opportunities that smart, sustained action can actually capitalize on. Mexico is at one of those moments right now. It's a country that has been through extraordinary violence and pain over the last 2 decades of the cartel wars. Its people deserve stability. They deserve safety. They deserve to not have highways blocked and cities paralyzed every time a cartel boss changes. Whether this is the beginning of that or just the beginning of the next bloody chapter, I genuinely don't know. Nobody does yet. What I do know is that I'll be watching this as closely as anything I've covered, and I'll keep bringing you updates as this story develops, because it is nowhere near over. If you stayed with me through this whole thing, thank you for your time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think this goes from here? Does the CJNG hold together, or does it fracture? Is Mexico about to get more violent, or is this actually a turning point? I'm curious where you all land on this. Stay safe. I'll see you in the next one.